The thermometer shattered at 58 degrees Celsius, its mercury pooling like tears on the cracked earth, and Aisha knew that even the metal couldn't bear witness to her suffering anymore. In the heart of the Sahara, where the sun had forgotten mercy and the wind carried only whispers of death, she had become something the world refused to see, a ghost living among ghosts, breathing fire instead of air. The last drop of water in her goatskin pouch had evaporated 3 days ago, but Aisha didn't panic. She had learned that panic was a luxury reserved for those who still believed in tomorrow. Instead, she pressed her cracked lips together and continued weaving the intricate patterns that had been passed down through 7 generations of Tuareg women, her fingers moving with mechanical precision despite the hallucinations dancing at the edges of her vision. Her name was Aisha Ag Adaha, though the world beyond these endless dunes had forgotten her completely. Once, she had been part of something larger, a nomadic community that moved like water across the desert, following ancient routes that connected oases like pearls on an invisible string. But that was before the drought that lasted 4 years, before the wells dried up one by one, before the animals began dropping dead in their tracks, and before her husband Mousa had made the choice that would define the rest of her existence. The story began on a morning when the horizon shimmered with false promises of water. Aisha remembered waking to find Mousa already dressed, his indigo tagelmust wrapped around his face in the traditional manner, but something in his eyes was different. After 23 years of marriage, she could read the landscape of his emotions as easily as she could navigate by the stars, and what she saw there made her stomach clench with dread. "The elders have decided," he said without preamble, his voice muffled by the cloth. "We leave with the sunrise caravan tomorrow. All of us." But Aisha knew better. She had heard the whispered conversations around the dying embers of their cooking fires, had seen the way the other families counted their remaining animals, their dwindling supplies. There wasn't enough water for everyone to make the journey to the refugee camps near the Malian border. Someone would have to stay behind. "All of us except me," she said, and it wasn't a question. Mousa's silence was answer enough. In the cruel mathematics of survival, an aging woman was a liability the group couldn't afford. Aisha was 54, past her childbearing years, and her arthritis made her slower than the others when they needed to move quickly. The decision had already been made by men who weighed lives like merchants weigh grain. "I won't let you stay alone," Mousa said, but even as he spoke the words, they both knew they were hollow. He was the group's guide, the only one who still remembered all the water sources, all the safe passages through the shifting sands. Without him, 27 people would die. With him, but without her, 27 people might live. "You will," she said simply, "because you're not choosing between me and them. You're choosing between me dying alone or all of us dying together." That night, they made love for the last time under stars that seemed to mock them with their cold brilliance. Aisha memorized the feeling of Mousa's weathered hands on her skin, the rhythm of his breathing, the way he whispered her name like a prayer. When she woke the next morning, he was gone, and the silence that replaced him was so complete it felt like drowning. The first month was the hardest. Aisha had prepared as much as she could. She knew which insects were safe to eat, how to collect moisture from the air using scraps of fabric, how to find the tiny succulent plants that stored water in their leaves. But knowledge and reality were different countries, and the border between them was marked with pain. She talked to herself constantly, then to Mousa as if he were still there, then to God, then to the desert itself. The conversations became arguments, then became songs, then became something that wasn't quite human anymore. Sometimes she would wake up and find that she had been walking in her sleep, following some phantom caravan across the dunes. But Aisha discovered something unexpected in her isolation, a strength she had never known she possessed. Stripped of everything that had once defined her identity as wife, mother, community member, she began to rebuild herself from the inside out. She became someone new, someone who could survive on less than what would kill most people, someone who could find beauty in the way the light changed color as it passed through the heat waves. The shelter she built was a masterpiece of ingenuity. Using the metal frame of an abandoned truck she had found buried in the sand, she constructed a dwelling that was part tent, part cave, part sculpture. During the day, she would retreat into its shaded interior and work on her crafts. During the night, when the temperature dropped to a merely unbearable 30 degrees, she would venture out to hunt for food and water. She learned to read the desert like a book written in a language older than words. A certain type of bird meant water within 2 days' walk. The way the sand shifted in the wind could tell her if a storm was coming from the north or the south. The color of the sunset revealed whether tomorrow would bring killing heat or merely dangerous heat. Months passed, then seasons. Aisha's body adapted in ways that would have amazed medical researchers had any been around to study her. Her kidneys became incredibly efficient at conserving water. Her skin developed an almost supernatural resistance to UV radiation. Her cardiovascular system learned to function at temperatures that would send most people into heat stroke. But the most remarkable change was mental. The solitude that should have driven her insane instead gave her a clarity she had never experienced. For the first time in her life, every decision was entirely her own. Every moment belonged to her completely. There was something intoxicating about this absolute freedom, even as it existed alongside absolute suffering. She began creating art from the materials the desert provided. Sculptures made from bleached bones and twisted metal, intricate patterns drawn in the sand that she knew would disappear with the next wind. The work became her religion, her therapy, her reason for continuing to breathe. Each piece was a conversation with eternity, a way of saying I was here to a universe that seemed determined to erase her. The animals found her first. Desert foxes would appear at twilight, watching her with intelligent eyes before disappearing into the gathering darkness. A family of jerboa, tiny hopping rodents, took up residence near her shelter, and she found their nocturnal rustlings comforting. Even the occasional viper seemed to regard her as part of the landscape rather than an intruder. Then came the birds. Ravens, mostly, but also hawks and the occasional eagle. They would perch on the highest point of her shelter and regard her with what seemed like professional interest. Aisha began leaving small offerings for them, insects she had caught, scraps of the lizards she managed to trap. In return, they would sometimes drop items at her feet, shiny bits of metal, colorful stones, once even a plastic bottle cap that she treasured like a jewel. The first human she saw after 8 months of solitude was a mirage. At least, she thought it was a mirage. The figure appeared on the crest of a distant dune just as the sun was setting, silhouetted against the orange sky. Aisha watched it for hours, expecting it to vanish like all the other hallucinations, but it remained stationary through the night. In the morning, she climbed to a higher vantage point and used a piece of polished metal to flash signals in the figure's direction. To her astonishment, the signals were returned. Someone was actually there, someone real, someone alive. It took her 2 days to reach the other person, a journey that would have been impossible during her first months in the desert, but which she now completed with the steady efficiency of someone who had learned to treat the impossible as merely difficult. What she found when she crested the final dune was both heartbreaking and beautiful. The figure was a child, a girl of perhaps 10 or 11, from the Fulani people who herded cattle across the Sahel. She was dying, that much was obvious, but she was dying with a dignity that reminded Aisha of herself. The girl's name was Fatoumata, and she had been separated from her family during a sandstorm 3 weeks earlier. Aisha knew immediately that she faced another impossible choice. Her resources were barely sufficient to keep herself alive. Taking responsibility for another person, especially a child, would almost certainly mean death for both of them. But as she looked into Fatoumata's eyes that held the same mixture of fear and determination she had seen in her own reflection, she realized that some choices transcend logic. She carried Fatoumata back to her shelter, and for the first time in months, the desert felt less lonely. The girl was too weak to contribute much practically, but her presence transformed everything. Aisha found herself singing the old songs, telling the traditional stories, performing all the small rituals that connected them to their ancestors. She was no longer just surviving, she was preserving something precious. Teaching Fatoumata the skills she had learned became a joy that surprised Aisha with its intensity. She showed the girl how to find water in seemingly barren places, how to predict weather patterns from subtle changes in the air, how to navigate using the stars. In return, Fatoumata brought news of the outside world, fragments of stories about refugee camps and aid organizations and climate change conferences held in air-conditioned buildings thousands of miles away. But more importantly, the girl brought laughter. Even in their desperate circumstances, Fatoumata would find reasons to smile, to make jokes, to turn their daily struggle for survival into a kind of game. Aisha had forgotten that survival could be joyful, that even in the harshest circumstances, humans could create moments of lightness. The months they spent together were simultaneously the hardest and the happiest of Aisha's desert exile. Their resources were stretched beyond breaking point, but somehow they managed. They developed an elaborate system for collecting morning dew, learned to farm edible insects, even figured out how to make a kind of bread from grass seeds they gathered during their rare good days. Fatoumata grew stronger under Aisha's care, but Aisha herself was failing. The years of extreme survival had taken a toll that she had been able to ignore when she was alone but could no longer hide. Her hands shook more than they used to. She tired more easily. Sometimes she would forget things, simple things, important things. One morning, she woke to find Fatoumata gone. The panic was immediate and overwhelming. Aisha searched frantically, calling the girl's name until her throat was raw, following every footprint in the sand until they disappeared into rocky ground or were erased by wind. But Fatoumata had vanished as suddenly and completely as she had appeared. For 3 days, Aisha barely ate or slept, consumed by the fear that she had somehow failed in her duty to protect the child. But on the 4th morning, she found a message drawn in the sand near her shelter, symbols in Fatoumata's careful handwriting that spelled out "thank you" in Arabic script. Understanding dawned slowly, painfully. Fatoumata hadn't been lost or taken. She had left deliberately, quietly, in the way that desert people understood goodbyes. The girl had realized what Aisha couldn't bear to admit, that staying together meant they would both die, but separating might give them each a chance. The loneliness that followed was different from the solitude of her early months. This wasn't the absence of human contact. It was the presence of loss. Aisha grieved for Fatoumata the way she had never allowed herself to grieve for Moussa, for her old life, for all the things the desert had taken from her. But grief, she discovered, could be transformed into something useful. She began creating her most ambitious artwork yet, a massive spiral pattern carved into a flat expanse of hardpan, visible from great distances, that told the story of her life and Fatoumata's in the symbolic language of her people. It was meant to be seen from the sky, a message to satellites and aircraft and anyone else who might be looking down from above. The work took months to complete and required her to develop new techniques for moving heavy stones and digging precise lines in the unforgiving ground. But it gave her purpose during the long days and something to think about besides the slowly diminishing returns of her survival strategies. She was putting the finishing touches on the outermost ring of the spiral when she heard the sound that would change everything, the distant drone of an aircraft engine. Aisha had seen planes before during her years in the desert, high silver specks that appeared and disappeared without acknowledgement. But this one was different. It was flying low, following a search pattern, and as it passed over her position, she could see someone leaning out of an open door with binoculars. The plane circled back, then again, and on the 3rd pass, it dropped something, a small package attached to a bright orange parachute that drifted down like a gift from the gods. Inside was a radio, a water purification tablet, and a note in French that made her heart stop. "We are looking for Aisha Ag Adaha. If you are receiving this message, please respond on channel 16. Your husband is alive. Your family is waiting for you." The world tilted on its axis. Moussa was alive. More than that, he was looking for her. For 3 years, she had assumed that the group had either died in the desert or disappeared into the anonymous masses of refugee camps. She had made peace with the idea that she would never see any of them again. But they had survived, and somehow, impossibly, they had found the resources to come back for her. The rescue itself was almost anticlimactic after years of epic survival. A helicopter arrived the next day, piloted by members of an international humanitarian organization that specialized in locating missing persons in conflict zones. They had been hired by Moussa, who had spent 3 years working in the gold mines of Burkina Faso to earn the money needed to fund the search. As Aisha climbed into the aircraft, she looked down her shelter, her artwork, the landscape that had been both prison and temple for so long. Part of her wanted to stay, to see how much longer she could push the boundaries of human endurance. But the larger part of her was ready to rejoin the world of human connection, to share the wisdom she had gained in her exile. The reunion with Moussa was everything she had imagined and nothing like she had expected. He was older, greyer, marked by his own suffering, but his eyes still held the same love she remembered. When they embraced, she could feel how much weight he had lost, how his body had been hardened by years of manual labor in brutal conditions. "I never stopped looking," he whispered into her hair. "Not for one day." "I know," she said, and realized that somewhere in her heart, she had always known. The desert had taught her many things, but perhaps the most important was that love, real love, transcends physical presence. The story should have ended there, with the triumph of love over impossible odds, with the reunion that defied all reasonable expectations. But life, as Aisha had learned in the desert, rarely follows the patterns we expect, because the truth was more complicated than anyone imagined. As they flew toward the refugee settlement where the rest of their group had made a new home, Moussa told her the rest of the story, the part that made her 3 years of solitude both more tragic and more miraculous than she had understood. The group had tried to come back for her after only 6 months. They had organized a rescue expedition, pooled their resources, hired guides who knew the deep desert. But when they reached the coordinates of their old camp, they found nothing. No shelter, no signs of life, no trace that anyone had ever been there. They had searched for weeks, expanding their radius, checking every possible location where she might have gone. But the sandstorms of that season had been particularly fierce, reshaping the landscape beyond recognition. They concluded, heartbrokenly, that Aisha must have died and been buried by the shifting dunes. It was only when satellite imagery became available to humanitarian organizations that anyone spotted the massive spiral artwork she had created. At first, researchers thought it was an ancient archaeological site, something created by a lost civilization. It took months of analysis before someone realized that the pattern was recent, that it told a story, that it might be a message from someone still alive. "You mean," Aisha said slowly, "that if I hadn't built the spiral, you never would have found me?" Mousa nodded. "The artwork saved your life. But more than that, it saved all of us. Because we never stopped grieving for you, never stopped feeling guilty for leaving you behind. Finding you alive has given us back something we thought we had lost forever." As the helicopter carried them toward their new life, Aisha understood the final lesson the desert had taught her. Her survival hadn't been just about endurance or adaptability or even love. It had been about the power of creation to transcend destruction, about the ability of art to communicate across impossible distances, about the way human expression could transform even the most hostile environment into something meaningful. The refugee camp where her family had rebuilt their lives was nothing like the desert, but it was also nothing like the traditional nomadic existence they had once known. It was something new, something that combined old wisdom with new realities, ancient traditions with modern necessities. And in that space between what was lost and what was possible, Aisha found her place. She became the camp's unofficial historian, the keeper of stories that might otherwise be forgotten. She taught children the traditional crafts, the old songs, the navigation techniques that satellites had made obsolete but which still connected them to their ancestors. And she continued to create art, but now her medium was community itself. The spiral in the desert became famous, studied by anthropologists and featured in documentaries about climate change and human resilience. Aisha gave interviews to journalists who wanted to understand how someone could survive alone in such conditions, but she always steered the conversation back to larger questions about adaptation, about what it means to be human in an age of environmental collapse. But the real story, the one she told only to those closest to her, was about the unexpected joy she had found in solitude. Not the romantic notion of finding oneself in the wilderness, but the deeper recognition that even in the most extreme circumstances, humans could create meaning, beauty, connection. The desert had stripped away everything she thought she needed and revealed what she actually needed to survive and thrive. Years later, when researchers returned to study her former shelter site, they found that the area had become an oasis of sorts. The techniques she had used to collect and conserve water had altered the local microclimate just enough to support plant growth. Her presence there, her refusal to surrender to the desert's hostility, had literally transformed the landscape. Today, Aisha is in her 60s, a grandmother to children who have never known the nomadic life but who carry its traditions in their hearts. She still dreams sometimes of the vast silence, the star-filled nights, the absolute freedom that came with having nothing left to lose. But she no longer longs to return to that place, because she understands now that the desert lives inside her, that its lessons are portable, that its gifts can be shared. The thermometer that shattered at 58 degrees Celsius has been replaced by the warm laughter of children learning to weave, by the gentle arguments of elders planning the camp's future, by the sound of Mouse's voice as he tells their story to visitors who come seeking to understand how love can survive anything. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, Aisha still hears the desert calling. Not with the voice of suffering this time, but with the voice of possibility, reminding her that humans are capable of adaptation beyond imagination, that even in the harshest places, life finds a way to create beauty, meaning, and hope. What do you think about Aisha's incredible journey? Have you ever found strength in unexpected places, or discovered that you were capable of more than you imagined? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how her story resonates with your own experiences of resilience. And if this story moved you, please like this post and subscribe for more untold stories of human courage and survival from around the world.